The cost discussion here, I think we want to speak about relative cost between the practices and do some general comparisons. But of course, cost is such a site-specific issue and so dependent on scale and so many other factors. But I did want to provide some examples that I think illustrates how typically the cost of low impact development practices and approach relates to traditional. And so this is a little study that I did for a port district that was contemplating a development, and in the preparation of their grant application for this development, wanted to illustrate the value in this case for this scenario of basically doing low impact development versus traditional for water quality only. So we have a typical double-loaded parking lot. I provide the dimensions, very standard, 22-foot travel lane, 9x18 parking stalls. I even excluded the flow control benefits in this case for doing this cost comparison. This site happened to be favorable for infiltration, and so those benefits are excluded because I wanted to really be focused on just the stormwater quality treatment. So in this case, what you can see here is we've got a parking lot where we've got a landscape island, and then we're taking that landscape and stormwater catch basins and conveyance and a little storm filter, and we're comparing that to taking that same landscape island, and instead of it being raised with landscaping, we depress it and make it into a bioretention cell. This was the exercise, and I did this kind of per lineal foot of double-loaded parking lot stall just to kind of get apples to apples, and you can kind of run through the assumptions that were made that informs this. But in this case, we're seeing that it's about $25, which is about 10-12% less to do low-impact development for our stormwater treatment here than it would have been to put in the equivalent filter. That's very expected, and that's really because when we use low-impact development practices such as bioretention in this way, we're getting multiple benefits for the same thing. So we're taking landscaping that we would have built to just be landscaping, and now that landscaping is also providing our stormwater quality treatment. And so that's really the lens that I use, and those are the opportunities that I seek out on projects to be able to come up with a low-impact development sort of system that works in a very cost-competitive way with a conventional system. Water Environment Research Foundation cost calculator there, where they collected installed costs of these practices primarily from the East Coast, with the next few slides from the WRF calculator, which is really some of the best objective data. But what we did is we combed the available resources to try and get out what sort of information is available. And so this just gives you a sense to kind of squint at it here, which is what the installed cost of a rain garden if people are building it themselves versus if you're hiring a contractor to build it. You can see there's the scale, the average size, so you can get a sense of the scale. Closer to home in Seattle, from the RAIN program, this is what Seattle is seeing for the installed cost for people who build their own rain gardens, $5 and change per square foot, and if you hire somebody, $16 and change. I believe the City of Seattle's current estimation for installed cost of bioretention, at least $10 more per square foot than the 16. I believe it brackets around 30 in place cost. Now, of course, it's a whole host of questions about what's included in that number. This is some research that I did specifically for this training. I just went to the WSDOT unit price database and started looking at some recent bid tabs that WSDOT and compared what their bids they're seeing on pervious versus conventional. And what you can see there on a per ton basis is that there's a small premium. You're looking at 105, so it's $20 a ton there on the low end and $35 a ton on the high end, spread between pervious and dense graded. And that's just for the pavement material, and that of course excludes the cost savings that we would see from not needing catch basins, pipes, and even potentially curbs in some of these situations in a parking lot. So I think that shows us that, yeah, it's a little more for the in-place costs of the pervious. And I did a similar thing for permeable concrete. Each of those dots on those lines was a particular bid for that bid item on a particular project. I've got 3 projects here. So you can see there's the low bid is the ones all the way off to the left, and I did it right up for the high bid. I drew the cloud around that lower part of the curve because it seemed like for their in-place costs of pervious cement concrete pavement sidewalk, which they do, you can see there, some of them included some extra thick pavement because some bike lanes were actually included in the bid for the sidewalk. But I think we squint at these things, we see that it's basically $5-6 a square foot in place with the base. What cistern costs, storage costs are. The one in the upper left there, high-density polyethylene plastic cisterns. They are about 50 cents a gallon if you're using the size cisterns that I usually use, which is the 3 and 5,000 gallon scale. If you're going to use a more like a little 250 or something, then that price is usually going to be closer to, it's going to be over $1, maybe even as high as $2 a gallon for the smaller. I think there's an economy of scale here that's important. These are the in-place costs of just the storage component, so excluding the pumping and the collection and all that, which is going to be super site specific. Yeah, including bladders, the one that's in the top there, which can be a nice system to throw in a crawl space. It comes a little bit tricky on some of the plumbing on the head end, but there's some ways to deal with that.
I've done a lot of green roofs over the years, and I always laugh when somebody tells me how much they cost, because I think they've been from $5 a square foot up to about $100. The difference between extensive roof being a low maintenance, thin soil profile, 3 to 4 inches of soil with low maintenance sedums or other succulent vegetation, versus the other end of the spectrum being a high-end, accessible roof terrace, and the cost differentiation between that. So the idea of semi-intensive, so you start growing in depth of soil and growing in diversity of vegetation. You go from extensive to intensive, and semi-intensive is sort of somewhere in between. So the idea being these give you a broad range of how much that's going to cost, but there's a ton of factors. Access. One of the major factors we've run into is public versus private. If you have a prevailing wage project that's a public agency, that'll probably double the square foot cost a lot of times, just because the amount for labor in those cases is significantly more. The big thing also to consider is economy of scale, 1,000 square foot versus 30,000 square feet. So once you get into that economy of scale of 30,000 square feet, your per square foot cost goes down. The other part of it is roofing is going to vary. If it's a new construction or maybe you're retrofitting and putting on a new roof, that's factored into the cost of that. There's not a lot of extra that needs to happen in addition to the re-roofing itself. But when we talk about return on investment, this is one case where green roofs have a great benefit because the stormwater benefits, but the biggest cost savings and the biggest return on investment is you double the lifespan of the roof. So when you start looking for a public agency or a long-term building owner that's putting on a new roof, and you can double the lifespan of that, you look at pretty significant cost savings over a long period of time. And that's a big selling point.
So this comparison, just to see the types of activities that are typically required to maintain LID facilities, the levels of effort in terms of the expense of that are going to be covered here at a general level. But you can see that some of them are exactly the same, doing some inspections, we're checking the inlets and the outlets, checking the weirs and so forth. And then there's a bunch that are different, like biofiltration swale, which is going to be grass, it's just going to be mowed, whereas a bioretention facility in the same footprint would of course need to be weeded and maintained more like landscaping, and having the mulch dealt with, in particular with bioretention cells that are receiving runoff from pollution generating hard surfaces, oils and so forth. All the stuff that we want to remove from the stormwater is going to be trapped up in that mulch, and so that mulch is going to need to be changed. And these cost numbers are provided based on a very general look at some levels of effort. Costs are meant to be kind of squinted at as well, but to give you a sense of the frequency that we expect these facilities to need, you can sort of see the frequency of attention for bioretention. So the upper one is really more of from a national database, and the one at the bottom is a more local. These are annual expenses per square foot of facility due for maintenance. That effort at the bottom really was only looking at 7 sites, primarily in Seattle. Bringing some of those cost numbers into kind of 30-year net present value, we see some of the costs per square foot of facility for a 30-year basis. Now, it needs to be understood, too, that the amount of square feet of bioretention that you need versus the per square foot of, say, a wet pond is radically different. The tributary area of a wet pond is going to be significantly larger. Or it could be pretty similar depending on the depth. This just gives you a sense of what a review of the literature tells us. Similarly for pavement, with the kind of maintenance frequency, which I think is the most important information on this slide to give a sense, and really it's the sweeping, that's the key, that the routine sweeping. I think shooting for that medium level High level on monthly sweeping certainly would be nice, but not, I don't think, practical. Although in some commercial settings, the parking lots are swept monthly, but typically by a sweeper that's not typically a high efficiency vac sweep like a municipality would have. Don't trap the fines and tend to blow the dust out the back a little more than the more municipal owned high efficiency vac. Point being, maintenance frequency illustrated there shows kind of what the expectation is. And looking closer to home in Puget Sound, unfortunately only at one installation, looking at about 2 cents per square foot for expected cost for sweeping 2 times a year. The real message is the bottom one, which is that if you don't do your routine sweeping, you don't spend the 2 cents per square foot per year, you're going to end up spending $1 a square foot to do a restoration process. Again, some O&M expense here, 30-year net present value of the effort on pervious pavement, conventional pavement. The reason the spread there between the permeable sidewalk and the vehicular permeable surfaces is essentially because the sidewalk has to be done essentially with a hand vac versus just running around the parking lot with a large sweeper vac to get the lower cost there. So there are several resources, all of which are available online. Of course, the 2012 Stormwater Management Manual, the LID Technical Guidance Manual, and the LID O&M document, kind of being the 3 real key documents that contain all the technical information that you will need to be successful designing and installing these. There are a series as webinars that are available. The web links are here. There's trainings that Ecology has out specifically on WIM 2012 to understand how it works and specific to the LID practices. And then the Rain Garden Handbook, simplified, a little less technical, a little more graphic document that's really great for homeowners and other sort of non-professionals to be able to use that and be successful building rain gardens.